Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Jarrett. As he mentioned, my name is Christel Kjenner, and I am the Director of Housing and Homelessness with the City of Edmonton. I'm really happy to be here today. I really work, since I started my role in March, I've gotten the opportunity to work really closely with Susan and others from Homeward Trust and a lot of other people in the room today, actually. And it's been a real pleasure. There's a lot of great people working in the sector, and I'm looking forward to meeting and working with more of you. I think if I'm not an academic, so my background is I'm a public servant. I have spent time on both the political and the administrative sides of government, and so I think that gives me a slightly different perspective on the topic today. And I think if anyone wanted to, I should say, as some of you may or may not know, I have an identical twin sister, actually. So if you're thinking I look familiar, I'm not Dr. Elaine Heshka. In fact, I'm her identical twin, Christel. And I think if someone wanted to make me feel insecure about the decision not to follow or pursue a PhD myself, it would be to sandwich me on an agenda like this in between two academic doctors. But that's okay. I think my perspective is different, and what I lack in, I guess, academic credentials, I will most certainly make up for in fast talking and text-heavy slides. So maybe without further ado, I'll get to that. So today I'm just going to talk for a little bit, and I'll try not to take too long, about what the City of Edmonton's role is in affordable housing. And so as I'm sure many of you in this room are aware, municipalities across Canada have all engaged on this issue in a different way. There really isn't a consistent approach outside of some provinces where municipalities have been more formally empowered, I suppose. So in Alberta, though, where this mandate still officially rests with both the federal and the provincial governments, our role has been sort of freestyling, and we've sort of had the opportunity to shape and define that ourselves. And so I'll start by just talking about sort of how we define affordable housing in Edmonton, at least from the city's perspective. And then I can just do a little brief overview of how we see the need today. And then I want to update you on sort of our strategic direction of where we're going and where we've been in recent history and how that's going to change as we move forward. So as many of you are aware, obviously affordable housing is a fundamental to the physical, economic, and social well-being of individuals and families, and it's a core component of diverse and inclusive communities, which is something that we really value at the city. We have had multiple touch points into this issue in the past. Most recently, we were the city, and through the mayor and my branch in social development, was responsible for the End Poverty Edmonton strategy, which identified affordable housing as a game changer, and also we're involved in updating the 10-year plan to end homelessness, so a place to call home. So what do we talk about when we're talking about affordable housing? And what does that mean? So obviously everybody has, although we're a sector that loves precision in terms, everybody has slightly different uses of them. So when I'm talking about affordable housing, the way that we conceive of it at least is broadly speaking along the spectrum, we have the 4 buckets, and our technical definition is housing that's made affordable through either upfront or ongoing government subsidies, and it's targeted to individuals who earn below median income. And so as part of that, there's also obviously the spectrum piece, and so at the city we engage in all 4 of those areas, although our role on the permanent supportive housing piece is certainly new and evolving as we speak. So I won't go into this in great detail because I'm sure everyone here is familiar with them, but essentially we're talking about affordable homeownership programs through the city's own First Place program, which is sort of a slightly very, very lightly subsidized affordable homeownership program that was launched in 2008. We also work with Habitat for Humanity specifically on a number of projects. Then we also are active in the affordable housing space around near market and the city's Cornerstones programs that were launched in 2006 and 2008. We're very focused in that space. And then there's obviously also social housing. And as you may or may not be aware, the City of Edmonton actually directly owns over 1,000 units of social housing that's managed by Capital Region. And we a lot of Capital Region's other social housing developments, I think about 2,000 or 2,500, I'm looking at Judy in the back, are also on city-owned land. So although we're not actively developing in that space right now, we are very involved as a key stakeholder and an owner in many spaces, in many regards. And then, as I mentioned, with permanent supportive housing, which in Edmonton we define as being primarily targeted towards people who are at risk of homelessness or have experienced chronic homelessness. So today in Edmonton, there's approximately 18,000 affordable housing units, and that's according to the inventory that we maintain. That includes about 200 non-seniors permanent supportive housing sites. We distinguish there because obviously there's different types of supportive housing. And then also there's about 4,500 units of social housing and about 13,500 affordable housing units, which sort of fit into the other categories. And although there's been a lot of talk about concentration of affordable housing in different parts of the city, and certainly that exists, for the most part, affordable housing can be found in all parts of the city. So today, housing affordability remains a significant concern, as we all know. In 2016, there was 48,550 low-income renter households that experienced housing affordability challenges, being defined as spending more than 30% of their income on shelter costs. And then, equally, and if not more concerning, there's actually also 22,000 households that experience severe housing affordability challenges, which meant that they're spending more than 50% on their income on shelter costs. And as we know, that's a large number, and we know that a lot of those people are also spending upwards of $50,000. And there's been some really interesting research that's been done recently by the multicultural health brokers with refugee and newcomer populations that show households spending upward of 90, 100% of their income on shelter costs. So we know that this is an issue, a really important issue in Edmonton. And also very concerning is that the numbers are getting worse. Since 2001, you can see that shelter costs have been raising fairly consistently, or the number of households, experiencing core housing need has been increasing significantly, I guess. And so it has slowed down since with the economy a little bit, but it's going in the wrong direction, and that's something that we're hoping we can start to address. So today, if you use those numbers around core housing need as the driver or the indicator, there's significant supply gaps. And so we know, according to the updated plan to end homelessness and the work that Dr. Turner did, there's at least 916 units of permanent supportive housing required. And then there's also a big gap around the deep subsidy units, 25,000, and then the near market piece around 21,000. So what role does the City of Edmonton play today? So historically, the city's role has varied. At times, we've been heavily involved in direct development of affordable housing ourselves. We've been a policymaker, we've been a regulator, especially in the 90s, through where we had a big emphasis on how do we ensure market housing maintained at least minimum health and safety standards through our safe housing programs. We've also been a funder, obviously, and an advocate. So our role at any given time really depends on the actions of others and really what's happening in our external environment. I think the city's role has been shaped by those factors, and it's been one where we identify gaps and sort of seek to fill that gap. So today, what that looks like is our role is primarily based on collaboration, partnerships, and community co-investments, which means we are a limited funding partner. We have capital funding and grants available for affordable housing, and we also provide land directly for affordable housing through our surplus school site redevelopment programs and other sort of unique initiatives. And our council is extremely supportive of affordable housing and thinks, and I don't know how many of you listen to council meetings, but if you were to listen to them on a regular basis, you would hear often members of council have affirmed the commitment to this issue and identified this as one of their defining issues. And in particular, Councillor Walters, who I know really wishes he could have been here today, and Councillor McKean, who are our co-leads for this council initiative on, it's called the Councillor Initiative on Housing. They've both identified this as the most important issues for them this term. And so while they are very committed to it, they also recognize that the City of Edmonton doesn't have the financial means itself to solve this problem, and it's really critical that the province and the federal government provide financial support and funding to help us address the huge supply gap that we're facing. As well, the city works directly currently to support a range of nonprofit organizations that develop and operate housing. So some of those partners are listed there, but they include Home Ed, which is an arm's length organization owned by the city. Capital Region Housing is a big one I mentioned previously. Right at Home Housing, Homer Trust, Greater Edmonton Foundation, and there's many more great organizations in the city that we're working with today. And then lastly, we also have a bit of a unique role around working with industry. And so the city has this policy, which I'll speak about more later, which is called our developer-sponsored affordable housing, which seeks contributions from industry to affordable housing. So in 2015, so I guess just to give you a little history lesson really quickly, the city had most recent engagement with affordable housing began in around 2000 and in the early 2000s, I'll say. And so if you remember that time, the economy was booming, things were doing really well from an economic perspective, and we also had an increasing focus. Our homelessness was starting to rise, and in the early 2000s, there was and late 90s, the Joint Planning Committee, or the Edmonton Joint Planning Commission, I'm gonna mess it up, but you guys know this better than me, on housing, put out its first sort of report about the need in the community. And then starting with that, it started to get traction. I think Councillor Farah was probably on council back then. Former Councillor Michael Farah was probably on council back then. And city councillors started talking about it. And it sort of grew and grew until a really visual manifestation of the problem in 2006, 2007 was Tent City was outside Bissell Centre. And homelessness was very much on people's minds. And I remember actually at the time, I was working as a researcher in the legislature, the Legislative Assembly, and I remember writing questions for question period about the housing crisis and the affordable housing crisis. And so it was very much a top of mind issue. And so at that time, Premier Stelmach had announced an affordable housing task force, which culminated in essentially about $1 billion being put into the affordable housing system in Alberta. And so in Edmonton, a lot of that money, it was provincial money, was transferred directly to the city. And so in 2006, we received about, over the next 5 years, it was about $150 million, and the city matched some of that money as well ourselves, putting in about 50 million. And so there was a substantial investment, and we used that money to launch what we called the Cornerstones program, which was really focused on near market rental and expanding the increase of affordable rental. And so at the time, vacancy rates were near 0%, they were like 0.3% or 0.3%. And so there was a really big focus on how do we get more affordable rental, And so those strategy, that first Cornerstones program launched in 2006 and delivered over 3,500 units of affordable rental. So it was really big scale. And then in 2012, after all the money had sort of been expended, the city launched Cornerstones 2. And the model of Cornerstones 2 was based on the first program, and it was based on the assumption that additional block funding would be transferred from the province, and that we would just continue doing what we're doing and giving out lots of money, and everything would be great. But unfortunately, that block transfer and that significant reinvestment didn't come again, and so Cornerstones 2 was less successful and only accomplished about 700 or so units. And so in the backdrop of that, in 2015, both the province and the feds had started talking again about a reinvestment in affordable housing and new strategies. And so the city, to prepare for that, decided to develop a new affordable housing strategy that was sort of meant to be very broad and high level and flexible so that it could align to whatever would be coming from the feds and the province. And so that's a strategy that we have today. It's called the Affordable Housing Strategy 2016 to 2025. It has 4 goals in it, which, like I said, are quite broad, but it mostly focused on increasing the supply of affordable housing, maintaining the supply of affordable and market rental housing, enabling stable residential tenancies that transition people out of homelessness, and then anticipating, recognizing, and coordinating action to respond to housing and homelessness. So those are our 4 goals, and we're active in all 4 of those areas for the most part today. As some of you may or may not know, the city, part of my team is the Landlord and Tenant Advisory Board, which is very active in providing support to people that are facing crisis in their housing or facing eviction. And so that's this whole strategy sort of encompasses all the activities that we do. But since that strategy was approved by City Council in 2015, a number of things have changed. And so that's caused us to reevaluate and look at what we're doing and how we can better align to make sure that Edmonton maximizes on the potential of these announcements. And so the first thing that's changed is, I'll go through them each actually. So the first thing that's changed is that, and this is again probably not news to anybody, but as the federal government launched its national housing strategy. So that includes a co-investment fund and a few other key initiatives that essentially promise to bring more dollars for affordable housing over the next 10 years. And as the speaker before me mentioned, there's also a commitment, or Jared I think mentioned this morning, there's a commitment to ending homelessness or chronic homelessness by 50%. So I think that's an exciting strategy for us. It's exciting too because it signals sort of the merging together of the affordable housing and the homelessness worlds, which really shouldn't be separate. They're very connected, as the blue and yellow diagram showed this morning. And so more and more that's setting that direction of government, kind of bringing those two focuses together. The province also launched its own affordable housing strategy, which promises $1.2 billion over 7 years, and includes some specific targets for Alberta. They also have 4 specific programs that they're funding on the capital side around affordable housing, specialized housing, including permanent supportive housing, an Indigenous off-reserve housing program, and then their seniors housing programs. And then also, as everyone in this room likely knows, we in 2017, Homer Trust, in partnership with the city, completed its updated plan to end homelessness. And really, I think the important development for the City of Edmonton out of this was the emphasis on permanent supportive housing, which said although a lot had been done in the past to increase the supply of affordable housing under our Cornerstones programs, one of the areas that definitely needed more attention was this supply gap around supportive housing. And so that I think was a good reminder for City Council, who had been starting to ask more and more questions about homelessness and how the city was responding to the need there, that this is a really big goal and this is a really big target. As well, since in addition to those strategies, the Municipal Government Act was amended about 2 years ago to create, and in one of the things in the amendment, there was a whole bunch of amendments, but one of the ones that's most interesting for this room is the act was amended and it included a inclusionary housing provision in the act. And so basically what it says is that the City of Edmonton can require developers to contribute, make affordable housing contributions in exchange for compensation subject to a regulation. And so for those of you who are familiar with inclusionary zoning programs or inclusionary housing programs, how they work is essentially at the zoning process, the city could require a certain percentage of units be dedicated to affordable housing. There's really different ways of implementing it across the country. And so in Alberta, we know it's all going to be subject to regulation, and the regulation has not yet been released, although I think there is optimism that hopefully that'll be coming in the fall. And so that's going to have implications for something that the city's already doing, which is our city policy C582, which is called Developer-Sponsored Affordable Housing. And what that is it's a voluntary program that we negotiated with the development industry about. It's a practice actually that's been happening for probably over a decade, but we only formalized it in a policy in 2015. But basically what it means is that the city, when there's negotiated zones, which I won't get into the technical side, but a lot of sort of the downtown, anytime you're doing a custom zone, I suppose, we call it direct control zoning in Edmonton, the city has the right to purchase 5% of the units at 85% of market value. So we have a right to discounted units in those. And so under that program, we've, I think, acquired close to 25 units, looking at Teresa in the back. Yeah. So it's not a huge scale, but the importance, I think, of the policy as much as it's, is its symbolism and its formalization of a relationship and an expectation that since industry is the one that develops housing and there's a large proportion of the markets whose needs are not being met at that lower end of the spectrum, there's a role for industry to play in contributing to solving the affordable housing problems that our city faces. So, and I should just say, when we get that regulation, when we see it, then there'll be an opportunity for us to reconsider that program and to look at if there's ways of strengthening it or making it more effective. So we're really anticipating that. So in the context of all these changes and the context of having our strategy, we've noticed that there's a few things that we need to do to learn from past experiences to better prepare. So the first thing is, I guess what happened back in 2008, when all that money started flowing, and the province was also directly funding projects in Edmonton too, there was a lot of development around affordable housing. And I don't need to recount the history for some people here who probably still are slightly traumatized by it, but there was a lot of blowback around affordable housing in certain part of the city. And so there was a group of neighborhoods in Edmonton's inner city that really felt that all the affordable housing was going into their neighborhood, and that there was a lot of social disorder around homelessness and poverty that they were feeling disproportionate impacts around in the inner city. And so they came to city council and they organized to block projects, and there was a lot of sort of activity around people not wanting affordable housing in that part of their neighborhood, mostly or that part of the city, mostly in the inner city. And so the city council had a long sort of history back and forth of different things, and what it culminated in, or discussions around this, what it culminated in is in 2012, the city created this thing called the non-market housing pause, which meant that in 5 communities in Edmonton, the city would not invest in affordable housing in those neighborhoods, seeing that they already had a sufficient supply. And the pause was supposed to be in place for 3 years, which was supposed to allow for some time for the city and the residents of the neighborhood to dialogue and to rebuild some trust and just sort of take the temperature off and talk about how what the housing stock in their neighborhood should look like. And so that pause was supposed to expire in 2015, but it did, at the time after it expired, the residents came and they still felt that they weren't, that there was too much emphasis on affordable housing in their neighborhoods. They weren't satisfied, and so council said, we'll keep the pause in place until we can replace it with a citywide policy framework. So when I came into this role in March, I inherited this citywide policy, and so we looked back with the team, and a lot of work had been done about what could that look like? How could we formalize an approach that really said that affordable housing should be in all parts of the city, because we know that there's people that have affordability challenges in all parts of the city. And so what we did is we took that debate and we kind of turned it on its head a little bit, and we said, okay, when the city's making investment decisions in affordable housing, what are we going to look for? And so we talked instead, I think I probably have, yeah, here we go. So we talked about, looking at the neighborhood context is one thing, but there's other things that we want to see in affordable housing, and especially knowing that there's a need, especially on the deeper end of the spectrum, and there's a need around supportive housing. So what we did instead is we said, okay, we are going to make decisions based on this transparent, clear policy that says, when we're evaluating proposals, we'll look for 5 things. The first thing is we will look at the existing neighborhood housing ratio, and we'll look to see, is this neighborhood one that doesn't have any housing? Does it need affordable housing? And we'll evaluate the proposal in that context. That's one of the things. And to evaluate it, we had to set a target. And so in the past, it had been suggested that maybe 10% could sort of be a threshold. But what we said instead was, we're going to set a target, and we're going to set it according to evidence. And since if you take the inventory of existing affordable housing and you take those 48,000 households that are in housing need, you end up with 16% of the population, or 16% of the houses. And so what we said is the target that we would compare the ratio to is 16%, and we believe that every neighborhood in Edmonton should have 16% affordable housing, because that's what's sufficient to meet the need. And so that was the first piece. The second piece is we said when we're looking to decide how we're going to spend our money on affordable housing, we would look at affordability. And so that, for us, that means we reward projects that are more affordable. So have a deeper subsidy or have a longer length of the term. So preferably in perpetuity, but at least 20 or 30 years. And then finally, the third thing we said is we'd look at partner contributions. So as noting that the city is a limited funding partner, is there other resources involved in the project, including project income? So if mixed income projects bring project income, that's certainly part of the equation. And then the fourth thing is that we said we'd look at proximity to amenities and supports, with additional consideration for supports provided on site specifically. And then lastly, we said we'd look at overall project design, which will include things around environmental efficiency and accessibility, to align to both the federal and the provincial standards. And so council approved this policy last month, so and it's scheduled to take effect in January of next year. And so where we're going as a city is we're going to be launching a new grant program that uses this criteria to evaluate, and we're hoping to launch that in early 2019. And so we'll be making more capital dollars available for people building housing through a programs organized around these guidelines. And so that's one big piece of work. The next piece of work is we had a motion from council which said, you know, last time there was a provincial housing strategy and a lot of money started flowing. We had a lot of pushback and people who, you know, really didn't fully understand what we meant when we said affordable housing. There was sort of some fear and negativity, and how do we get out ahead of that, and how do we be proactive? So we've also put forward for consideration by council this fall to approve a budget request for a marketing campaign for affordable housing. And so what it would be is essentially a public information campaign that would clearly articulate the need for affordable housing and explain the rationale for the city's commitment to this goal, and essentially try to make it a little easier for projects that are going, or developments that are going into neighborhoods that may not have housing already, by already proactively mitigating some of the myths and fears around it and misperceptions, I suppose. So that's another piece of work that we're hoping to get started on. Third is we are working on what we're calling the Affordable Housing Public Engagement Charter. And this is really designed to just try and clarify expectations, because right now I think there's a misalignment of expectations sometimes between the neighborhoods and developers about who needs to be consulted when, you know, who has a right to put housing where. And so we are going through this process in the context of the city's new public engagement policy to come up with a very clear set of expectations so that everybody knows this is what the rules are, this is what we'll evaluate at least city investments by, to say this is who we engage, when we engage, and how we engage, and this is what we don't engage on as well. And so that work is also underway. Next, we're also working on an update to what we call our affordable housing investment plan. And really what this is it's going to articulate our what money is available for housing from the city, and then how we're going to spend it. And so if you follow the news, you may have noticed there's a lot of discussion around the municipal budget right now. We're right in the thick of municipal budget season. And the city a few years ago moved to a 3-year operating and a 4-year capital budget. So it means we only really make these big decisions every 3 and 4 years. So we're at the beginning of a new cycle this year. And so it's a really important time for us to try and for city council to really express its priorities through budget. And so in the budget, the city's asked for, for affordable housing, there's a service package requesting an additional $3.5 million a year to add to the city's grant programs. And then there's also an ask for $53 million over the capital budget cycle, for capital budget cycle for affordable housing. So in total, and then the city also has some money left in a housing reserve. So if we're successful in our requests, we are hoping to make, you know, somewhere between 60 and I'll say $80 million available for affordable housing in the next 3 and 4 years. So not insignificant, but not, you know, still there's obviously a really big need, and we're definitely going to need our provincial and federal funding partners to be there as well. But these requests, this is the city really trying to show that we can play a role and help channel further investment or leverage further investment from those orders of government. As well, our updated plan is going to talk about some of our priority areas, and for the first time in one of our investment plans, permit supportive housing will be a big focus, in addition to some of our existing programs around surplus school site redevelopment, secondary suite grants, and social housing redevelopment. As well, we are starting to get more involved, I think, the city on land specifically, and how do we make land. We've heard from providers that this is a gap, is access to land, and so that's something we're going to be focusing on too. Okay, and then I think I already spoke about this, so I won't belabor it, but if we get our regulation, then that's something else we're going to need to look for, is how do we work better with industry to leverage more private money for affordable housing as well too. Yeah, so just to recap, in 2019, so I just went through sort of our current work, but then in 2019, we're hoping we'll be launching our new grant programs early in the year. We'll also have we're also going to begin the process of updating our affordable housing strategy, which is going to be reaching its sort of midterm period. And so that should be a significant update, and will involve, we'll identify a new approach for the city to permanent supportive housing and land. And it will also include, we're also hoping that in 2019 we'll be working on implementing our marketing campaign and launching our public engagement toolkit to clarify expectations around engagement. So that brings me to the end of our presentation. I guess I'll just finish by saying, and I think although this is sort of our formal role and this is how we spend money, since I've come into the role, it's become really clear to me that there's also a really important opportunity for municipalities and the City of Edmonton in particular to spend, to really try and play a sort of convening, focusing, forcing people to have the conversation kind of role. I think that is an area that, you know, homelessness is such a big issue, of housing affordability is such a big issue, poverty is such a big issue, and we're not going to be able to address any of those issues effectively if everyone's not pulling in the same direction and having the hard conversations sometimes around is everything we're doing solving the problem? What are our priorities? How are we aligning our actions? And so I think another piece for the city will be moving forward. It's going to be as sort of the role of cities in Canada evolves, it's really becoming clear to me there's an opportunity for us to say, in Edmonton, this is what we care about, this is how we want all the money to be spent, and this is what we think is going to solve the problem. But the city obviously cannot do that alone, and it's entirely critical to, I think, to listen, understand, and work with the leaders that are every day involved and engaged on these issues. And so on behalf of myself, and I know there's at least like 6 others from my team here, and in addition to other people from different parts of the city, I think we all want to hear from you on a regular basis. I like Dr. Turner's, her 3 insights, and especially the one that says seek to be proven wrong. I think that's something that I personally, that's the approach that I take to my work every day. And I think sometimes in government, it's easy for us to say, we're the experts, we're the policymakers, we're going to make the policy. And it's true, that's our role to play, but I think we have one very specific and narrow perspective, and everyone engaged in this room in the community has incredibly valuable knowledge, insights, and perspectives, and they all need to be part of that policymaking process. And so if you see us out there, if you see someone, especially in the housing and homelessness section with the City of Edmonton name tag, approach them, give them your feedback, give them your input. We want to hear from you. We want to make sure that everything we're doing is responsive and actually solving and not hurting the problem, or making things better and not making it worse. And so I'll just maybe finish with that sort of note to say, please engage with us. Don't let us do what sometimes we do, which is just talk to each other. Like, come and talk to us. Come and tell us what you really think. We want to hear from you. And again, I really appreciate the invitation to be here today. And thank you. Okay, I guess I'm supposed to ask if you have any questions.
Christel, wow, you bring energy and enthusiasm. This is going to be amazing. My question is about permanent supportive housing. It's more than just housing. It's got that sort of medical model to it. So how do you see those moving parts coming together?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think, so that's something that we are definitely trying to learn more about, and I just had to write a report on permanent supportive housing that's going to committee in October, and it made me and our team, I think, very aware of how little we really do know about this specific part of the sector. But I think generally speaking, what we need to look at is obviously there's this whole spectrum. And for government, it's nice for us to put things into a box. You're this level, and this means you do exactly this, or you're this level, and it means you do exactly that. But we know in practice, those boxes are very messy, and the needs of the clients are very messy, and things can't just always follow a very specific framework. And so I think for us, the challenge is going to be, how do we bridge that accountability, emphasis on effectiveness, with our desire to be very flexible and supportive and meet the needs of individual clients. And so I guess from the city's perspective, what we'll be doing is, when we update our strategy, when we update our strategy, we're going to be working with people like Homeward Trust, other people involved in delivering supportive housing, to say, where are the gaps? We know there's a funding gap. We know there's a land gap. We know there's a zoning gap. We know there's all these challenges and barriers that government's currently putting in the way to getting this housing built. So how do we get those barriers out of the way? And if we need to bring AHS to the table, if we need to bring other parts of the province to the table, if we need to bring Homeward Trust to the table, if we need to bring homeless serving agencies to the table, we will bring everyone to the table, and we'll figure out what these gaps are, and we're going to report back on it every year. What are we doing, and are we making making it better or making it worse? And I think that's all we can do, is sort of just get started, essentially, and try to work through all those barriers as we encounter them. And so from the city perspective, I didn't mention, but we are doing a review of our zoning bylaw, and part of that is we have a motion from Councillor Walters asking us to go away and say, what can we change in the zoning bylaw to make it easier to build these types of developments because of the medical model on site for some of them. And so, yeah, I guess that's generally our approach, but we'll be really articulating that more clearly over the next year as we work on that strategic update. So.
Hello? Okay. Hi, Christel. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Sandra from Edmonton Social Planning Council, and I'm wondering what are some of the mechanisms for accountability for people to basically give you that feedback and to make sure that properties are consistently and appropriately managed, that tenants are getting the supports that they need. Because in a lot of the cases, those mechanisms are not always there or readily available or accessible to tenants. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Sure. Well, I think I think every funder has different accountability mechanisms that they use for the projects that they fund. And so when the city's involved, we have funding agreements and relationships with landlords that we can leverage to take that feedback. We also, and I know most agencies in Edmonton operate this way already, but encourage, to be a supportive landlord that's focused on, the needs of the community and hearing feedback. And in many times when people are complaining about the social impacts or the neighborhood impacts of an affordable housing development, it's not actually affordable housing that they're complaining about. Often it's, poorly maintained market housing, and there's an assumption that it is what it's not. So I think from the city's perspective, first of all, obviously there's a whole swath of things to deal with private landlords. We have a problem properties task force. We have other sorts of complaint-based stuff to deal with community concerns. But then if we're involved in a funding relationship, although I haven't seen this happen, we would obviously work with the provider to ensure that those needs are met. I think if that's a community concern you're talking about, if you're talking also about the needs of the tenant, I know there's a lot of work and thinking being done by Homer Trust and others around what is the appropriate role for a landlord, how do you be a supportive landlord by also maintaining the role of landlord, and sometimes there can be challenges between the needs of the client and the needs of the landlord to also respect, ensure the system is maintained and be responsible for the housing. And I'm not the best person to speak about that, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for clarity of those roles, and how do we clarify that, and so in the support of the whole system and ultimately the clients as well too, right? Because if you don't have clarity around those roles, sometimes it undermines the entire housing development, or it can undermine the system in many ways. And so I think there's work to be done there as well too, but I think it's something that people are really conscious of and talking about for sure. Sure.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Thank you. My question, I'm sorry, Sherry. My name is Sherry. Thank you for being here today. Just wanted to ask you, Councillor Michael Walters is working with the Municipal Act, the new government legislation that will be going in. So we're working with urban as well as rural in action of new legislation. Can you comment then just briefly on how we're going to be meeting those needs through industry, as well as maybe what you're alluding to on aspects about how do we bridge the gap between landlords, tenants, that sort of thing?
Well, in terms of the legislation that you referenced, the amendment to the Municipal Government Act, it's to the Municipal Government Act, which is a piece of legislation that governs all municipalities. And so if the regulation comes and it's going to be something that could be implemented by municipalities across Alberta, regardless of size. So that's the one piece there. And the main mechanism that would exist is it will be an enabling provision. So it'll be up to every municipality to then table its own bylaw or regulation that would then implement it. So it's not necessarily going to be a blanket approach that everyone will do, but in Edmonton, our council has expressed interest in a number of these amendments and how they could be implemented, and we'll be looking to administration to make a recommendation. And we've already began in earnest some conversations with representatives of industry. And I have to say, when I talk to them, like when I talk to representatives of industry, they see the problems too, and they understand affordability challenges very innately in many cases. And I know that they're eager to be more involved. In Calgary, there's been an industry push around a fundraising campaign, and I think there's an opportunity for something like that here too. So there's different mechanisms. There's going to be the regulatory one that could sort of compel action, but then I think there's also a lot of voluntary support and interest from industry, and like I can't tell you how many developers call us and say, like, we see this as a problem, we want to help, how do we connect in? And so I think there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm there, and I think that's something that we're working on. And then I'll just add, I know through LTAB, the Landlord Tenant Advisory Board, my colleague Junie Downey, who's also here, she works a lot with landlords and talks to them about how they can be supportive within their own rules and facilitate their tenants' needs and make sure that they're being respectful and responsive. And so that's another piece of our work, which I'm sure Judy could speak more about at the back if you have an interest in that specifically.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you were speaking about the landlord and tenant advisory board and whatnot, and how you're trying to get the landlords to be a little bit more understanding and accommodating. Well, I recently, a couple of years ago, went through that process, and even though I did win the case, I was still asked to leave to keep the peace. How is that accommodating?
Yeah, that doesn't sound very accommodating.
No, it's not. Even though I won the case, I was still asked to leave. And then when you bring up these developers and all and whatnot, why and these, what is it? It's called the NIMBY, I believe it was called, Not in My Backyard, that campaign. Why do we have to keep on accommodating this colonial society, accommodating these people who oppress the indigenous populations and the homeless populations in the first place, keeping this cycle going of poverty and homelessness and trauma, intergenerational trauma? All of it is all tied into accommodating these colonial systems, colonial populations. Why do we have to keep doing that? Why do we have to keep having these conversations? I am a part of End Poverty Edmonton. I came up with quite a few ideas, including getting the homeless populations to be a part of the, give them jobs to build affordable housing. Use what was it I called, Habitat for Humanity. Why not use that model? Why do we have to keep on paying these developers huge amounts of money for them to build on indigenous lands, which why not we just give the lands back to the indigenous populations so we can take care of the land and take care of ourselves rather than relying on your guys' systems, which do not work anyway?
That is a very good question, and that's a very good series of questions. I think the answer to the question is much bigger than anything that I can offer myself. But yeah, I mean, if I have asked those questions myself and wondered that myself, but I have a completely different perspective, I suppose. I guess all I can say is in government every day, we don't often get to ask those really, really big questions, but what we can do is try to elevate the voices asking those questions. And I would love to talk to you more specifically about those ideas that you just mentioned, and also provide you with opportunities where you can ask those questions to other people as well too. I think those are really, really big questions that deserve answers, but I'm not sure that I can give you that right now today myself. So I know. Thank you very much though, sir.
Thanks very much, and please join me.